Welcome and a very nice evening to the audience that we have here in the EU Pavilion, but also everywhere online. This is an event on the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change. I'm joined here with a couple of my colleagues and some members of the Secretariat. I'll introduce several of them later, but also by a wonderful panel. And we'll take you through the purpose, but also the location of the European Scientific Advisory Board in the ecosystem with several of these speakers in the discussion the coming hour. Some logistics first. My name is Maarten van Aalst. I'm one of the members of the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change. I'm also a professor of climate and disaster resilience at the University of Twente and director of the International Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. We have 15 members in the board, and again, I'll bring you some of them later in this session. In terms of the other logistics, as you can see, I'm wearing a headset. This is a silent event, so you will not be able to hear me, even though I have a loud voice, if you're sitting at the back. We also have an online audience. So if you want to hear as well, please do take the headsets and use them. We also have Slido, so you will be getting a code on the screen from when we get to the panel later to be able to ask your questions, so there's no need to go around here with microphones. But before we get there and we hear from the panel and we hear from your questions, it's a big pleasure to introduce the chair of our European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, Ottmar Edenhofer, who will give a quick introduction on the panel and its work. Ottmar, the floor is yours.
Very much. Can you hear me?
We can.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot. It's an enormous pleasure to present the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change and to explain a little bit our intention, how independent scientific advice can strengthen climate action. So the next slide, please. So let me start with a few aspects of the European climate law. The next slide, please. So the European climate law is a framework for reaching climate neutrality by 2050 in the European Union. And the European climate law consists of a few important features: a EU-wide legal target for climate neutrality by 2050 with negative emissions in the EU thereafter, a binding EU target of a net domestic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to the 1990 levels, a climate target for 2050 to be set within 6 months of the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement, and rules to ensure continuous progress towards global adaptation to climate change goal in the Paris Agreement. And one component of the European climate law, the next slide please, is the establishing a European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change. So what are the key features of this EU Advisory Board? Next slide, please. The EU Advisory Board should... Next slide, please. It should be a point of reference for the EU on scientific knowledge relating to climate change. And this is really a remarkable step that the EU and the EU law wants to have an independent science-based advice. We consist of 15 senior scientific experts on different nationalities. We are independent and scientific and technical expertise covers a broad range of relevant disciplines and sectors, from social science, economics, and adaptation. There's a gender balance, and we have a 4-year mandate, and there's a possibility that the members could be renewed once. So the next slide. I will not go to all the details of the 15 members. What I would like to communicate, it is an enormous pleasure and an enormous privilege to chair such a distinguished board with this variety of expertise, of background, and also the geographical diversity. So what are the main tasks of the EU Advisory Board? So first of all, we have to consider and analyze the latest scientific findings relevant to the EU. Some of us have a background from the IPCC, and we are basically trained to review the scientific literature. based on this latest scientific insights on the peer-reviewed literature, we are in a position to provide scientific advice, for example, on EU measures, targets, budgets, and also to assess and evaluate the coherence with the EU commitments. So the next slide, please. So one of the tasks is also to contribute to the exchange of independent scientific knowledge. We are part of a broader network, and within this broader network, we exchange our insights. We have to identify actions and opportunities to achieve the European climate targets. And last but not least, we intend to raise awareness on climate change and its impacts, and we intend to stimulate a dialogue and cooperation between scientific bodies within the EU. So we have been established at the beginning in March of this year, and we already can report on a few main activities over this year in 2022 from June to December. We have our work program has been adopted in June, and let me highlight a few aspects here. Next slide, please. First, so we provide an input on the EU 2030 to 2050 greenhouse gas budget and the 2040 target. So we prepare an input on the 2023 report on progress and consistency of policies. And it is here important to understand it is not just our intention to provide insights about the targets the EU should achieve, but also on the instruments, in particular on the policy instruments. And therefore, we address policy responses in the EU to the current energy situation. The sectoral mitigation solutions are important and they should be explored. Pathways, credible pathways, in particular also for LULUCF and agriculture and the links within adaptation. We have already provided an input on scenarios for planning EU energy infrastructure developments, and also we had a conference with national climate advisory boards within the EU, and we intend to continue this important dialogue with these national boards. Now let me highlight a few aspects here which are quite important in carrying out our research. The next slide, please. First of all, we are independent scientists. And independence is quite important because we want to provide science-based information and explore pathways which are real options for decision makers. In order to do this, we have to rely on our advice, of course, on the scientific facts. But as we know, when we explore options, this is not possible without value judgments. Value judgments are important, and there are no facts without values, and there are no values without facts. We do not hide our value judgments. We make our value judgments explicit so that policymakers can understand where we come from. We want to explore options rather than defending specific political positions. And we want to be strategic and proactive, and we would serve as a radar screen for emerging risks. So with that, I would like to conclude, and I would like to delegate now the next task to Martin to facilitate the debate. But let me conclude that we all, members of the Scientific Advisory Board, feel very privileged to be part of this important exercise within the EU. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Ottmar. That was a very clear introduction. If there are any questions, we will be able to come back to them later in the discussion with the panel. And there'll be 3 members with you in this event tonight. Ottmar, I understand you have to leave already halfway the hour, so maybe a quick round of applause already for Ottmar. And thank you for being with us tonight. So that then brings us to the panel discussion. We'll first have 3 external reflections, so not from within the advisory panel, but about how it sits in the ecosystem of the European Union. And then some reflections from advisory board members, and then a discussion with all of you, including online. And for that, we have a Slido set up. If I may have that on the screen, then you should be able to scan that code with your phone or also at home. And I will receive your questions in a moderated fashion. So feel free to already type them while speakers are having their interventions. We'll try and cluster a bit, so feel free to keep them coming, and we might not get to all of them. But please use it, especially also those watching at home and not able to wave for attention to me. This is a democratic way to have everyone here and around the world participating in the discussion after the panel. But before we get there, it's a real honor and privilege to introduce a wonderful panel that we have with us tonight. And I won't introduce them all at once, because that might be boring, but just one-on-one when I give them the floor for the first time. And starting with Michael Bloss, who is a member of the European Parliament for the Greens. He's been called one of the architects of the European climate law. And of course, the European climate law is what established the European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change. So you were negotiating the European climate law. You were one of the creators, in that sense, of the advisory board. How do you see the advisory board contributing to climate action in Europe?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation. And it's really nice to be here on this event, because I now feel that what we have been establishing in the climate law now becomes a reality. And I think it's the whole team that was responsible for this negotiation from the Parliament side that was really pushing for this scientific advisory board. And it's really great to see what kind of people are now in the advisory board. It's the brightest minds on climate science, and it's what we need to have to get advice. The reason why we did it is simple. If you remember the last European election, it was 2019, and it was the Fridays for Future movement, Greta Thunberg. They went all to the streets, and they had a very simple message, and that message was, listen to the science. And that's what we want to do. We want to listen to the science, but in order to do so, it's really important to have a scientific advisory board. And actually there's research, so we listen to the science, and it shows that in countries where there is already established scientific advisory boards, we see better climate policies, we see more ambitious climate policies. So evidently we also need one as the European Union. And I think another aspect is really important, because this is not the IPCC. No, this is not kind of a scientific board that brings together like all of the established scientific findings, because actually the truth is that we know already quite a lot on the climate crisis, and we know that we need to act. But it's actually an advisory board that really needs to inform policies, because that's what we do in the European Parliament. No, we do climate policies, we do the Fit for 55, we do emission trading, and for this we need to have advice from the scientific side. And in this way, of course, they also contribute to our climate actions. And also we need science to call us out in case we are just talking but not delivering on our targets. And you can also clearly project it sometimes. No, this is actually leading to you reaching Paris, reaching 1.5 or not. And this clear advice is something that is really needed on the policy side, and we're really looking forward to get that from your side.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. And it's very interesting to get these sorts of dialogues also as scientists, reflecting on how the scientific knowledge that indeed has been put together, and several of us have been contributing to the IPCC reports, where the rubber now really hits the road in terms of being most relevant to policymakers. And so we've heard the perspective from the Parliament. Now we go on to Clara de la Torre. You lead DG Clima, essentially the European Climate Ministry. So you're, in a way, at the receiving end of this advice now, having to put it into practice in terms of the EU's climate policies and also putting those policies in motion in the work of the European Commission. How does the arrival of an independent European Scientific Advisory Board affect your work?
Thank you. First, thank you for inviting us here, because as the European Commission, we are one of the main stakeholders and users of this advice. How does that affect? Let me take a step backwards. I mean, if there is one strength of climate policy, is that it has a very solid scientific basis. And that's a very important, very solid basis. There are few that don't believe that, but this is lost. So when you are a policymaker, to have sound, credible and independent advice is always very important. So as Mikhail was saying, these sort of mechanisms have proven their effectiveness. I've been working for many years in science and technology policy. And I've seen that one of the most critical and at the same time most difficult interfaces is precisely the one between the knowledge creation, the technology development and policy development. This is a critical one and a difficult one. So I very much welcome this committee, this advisory board, with such an eminent personalities and a broad coverage of disciplines or fields. Because as the chair was reminding us, we have a number of milestones in climate policy in which we will need this advice. And I'm very glad to hear that already preparations, thoughts about how are we going, or which target are we? It's up to the Commission to prepare to propose a target, but informing the preparation of this target for 2040, the budget for the CO2 budget for the period foreseen in the law, also helping us in monitoring the advancement in policy towards the climate neutrality, and as Michael was saying, calling us off, saying in case we are diverting. This always, it's important, it's reassuring, and it's giving a credibility to the policy that is necessary, and in moments where, such as those where we are here, is extremely important.
Thank you so much, Clara. And I think we're finding out how to dance this dance, right? How we can make our science most useful. That's also a matter of listening to you. And one thing I've appreciated already in the first couple of months of our work has been these dialogues with yourself, but also with your colleagues in the Commission. Science also is not just good by the virtue of its independence and its just being there. I think it's also up to us to find these interfaces, and that's been a very good learning process, I think, on both sides already. Our third panelist is Terry Lehtonen. Now, you're a state secretary. You're deep into climate policy yourself, but at a national level in Finland. You're a member of the European Union. You're also a country with your own climate policies, framed by your own Climate Act, informed by your own scientific panel. How do you think the European Scientific Advisory Board can add value to what you already have?
Well, thank you, Martin, and thank you for the invitation to join this panel. I find this also a very exciting moment in the European climate policy making. First, if you allow, just a few words about our national climate panel. It was established in 2011, and in 2015 it was established in our climate law and in the Climate Act, and as an independent scientific advisory body, and the tasks are very similar. The composition is very, very similar. The functions seem to be very similar. So I'm very pleased to see that, because that instrument has been very, very useful for the Finnish climate policy. And a prime example, if you allow, is the climate neutrality by 2035 target that we have now put into law in Finland by this government. That is based on our climate science panel's advice on what is consistent for Finland to be in line with 1.5 degree commitment that we made in Paris Agreement. And in fact, also now when we reviewed our Climate Act in order to incorporate that objective into law to be climate neutral by 2035 and climate positive or carbon negative thereafter. We also introduced greenhouse gas emission targets consistent with that path. And again, that was on the basis of the advice of our climate science panel. And needless to say, our panel has been assessing the government's policies and measures, whether we are matching the European objectives or we're on track to meet the obligations and the binding targets that we have under EU law, and also whether we're on track and on a path towards our climate neutrality. In my view, the European Advisory Board on Climate Change should do the same at the European level. And I was very pleased to see in Chair Ottomar Edenhofer's presentation that this seems to be what the panel will be doing. So I would like to the board to look at what would be consistent on the basis of science for EU budget, which is compatible with 1.5 degrees, and what would be the scientifically sound climate neutrality timeline for Europe in respect of 1.5 degrees. Also, it is excellent that the board will be looking at policies. I think and options. This is exactly something that our Finnish board or panel does as well, and it's very helpful for the policymakers to have sound advice on that. And of course, it's still the politicians who will be making decisions, but it just improves the scientific basis and fact-based policy making. I think looking at the European level, something that from a national perspective, I think the European level should be looking at is when we look at the science. I'm not a climate scientist, but it looks to me that we're going to be needing a lot of negative emissions or removals. And I think the European level would be, and the European board should look at this, the methodologies, the science on the removals and the conditions, criteria for negative emission pathways and technical removals, and sort of what would be the conditions or what would be the parameters to set how we could verify storing carbon in products. So I think this would be something important to do at European level and not necessarily or it would be duplication if we did that all at national level. I think for another experience that has been very valuable from national experience is the panels being a sort of credible reference for the media, for the public debate. And I think that has been very useful for informing the public debate in Finland as well. So maybe that would be something for the European board as well. And last but not least, I think just sharing of best practices between the science panels in member states and internationally. I think that is incredibly valuable as well. And again, I was happy to see that this is already on your agenda.
Great, thank you so much. I have a few questions here coming back to you, but I would actually suggest we just continue along the row here, introducing my two colleagues in the European Scientific Advisory Board to give their perspective on how our work has commenced. I mean, we've heard about the work program. You've heard also about the expectations. We have been having discussions about how to respond to these sorts of questions. Jean-François, you're Jean-François Susanna from France. You're also on the French High-Level Council on Climate Change, so you've had some experience also with these interactions. Maybe you can tell a bit about your own experience now with the European Scientific Advisory Board, and also reflect on the expectations expressed by the panelists.
Yes, thank you, Martin, and very glad to be with you tonight. So I think we did hear some very important comments from the panelists, and thank you so much for this. Let me say that I certainly support the view that an independent scientific advice can help developing more ambitious policies and can increase the accountability of the public policies. And we all feel that we live in a time of crisis. There was the COVID crisis, now we have the invasion by Russia of Ukraine triggering a huge energy crisis. And it's so important that our board can keep this independent advice at this time of those crises to show that the long-term goals should be there in the policies despite the short-term fluctuations. I think this was seen already, and we are actually developing a piece here, a study on how we should navigate this short-term crisis, both for the energy and for the food. As you mentioned, Martin, I'm also a member of the French committee, le Haut Conseil pour le Climat, and we've been working over 4 years. So we've been monitoring the advancement of the climate policies in France. And interestingly, we developed methods to assess the implementation gap, so this policy gap that we can see between the targets that are set by the government and the achievements that can be made. So we report to the French Prime Minister, and actually we also worked quite a lot on proposals to the government on how to improve the governance. Initially, we realized that not all ministries were sufficiently involved in the planning of the changes needed given the French climate policy. And we did suggest something which in the end happened, which is to regroup at the level of the Prime Minister the ecological planning. And I think, as we can see, it's not only giving advice on existing policies, it's also, at least for the French case, giving advice on the governance. So I'm really thrilled by this work we are developing in the European Committee. Part of this work is a bit aligned with what I've done with the French Committee because it's about the implementation gap, and this relates to the stock take on the policies at Europe level and also with member states. But we are also doing something even more difficult, maybe, which is to assess the scenarios and targets for 2040. And we do this by collecting all the pathways and assessing those pathways for Europe, following obviously the best IPCC methods, but also, and that's quite important really, looking at the values of Europe, the values that we can find in some in some texts of law, and that reflects the values. And this was said by Otmar, that we should not hide the values, we should make those values explicit. So this is really important, and it brings us to the long term. And in the long term, it was already mentioned by the panelists, we will have this problem of having sinks that are sufficient to compensate our emissions. And that's why we plan in our work program special attention to the LULUCF, to the agriculture, and to the CDR. And as you said, there are certainly some methods to be developed to monitor those removals. And we need to do all this in the spirit of a just transition. This is really needed because otherwise it will fail. And transition is so important because we are already feeling the climate change impacts. And we all citizens are in fact experiencing these impacts. And so we do need to think on how this transition is needed both from the viewpoint of adaptation and what we do with mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean-François. And indeed, I think we're being confronted much faster also than many of us as scientists even had expected, both with impacts, but also with the just transition questions that, for instance, a heavy energy price shock is currently already imposing on Europe and its citizens. So much food for thought also for us as scientists, and much ongoing science where we don't have the luxury also of waiting for that to crystallize, but have to do this on the fly. Let me go to our final panelist, Elena Lopez-Gunn, who is from iCatalyst from Spain. We knew each other, actually I knew Jean-François from IPCC as well, but we knew each other working together on the Working Group 2 Area 6 report very closely, and now again in the Scientific Advisory Board. Would you like to add some thoughts to what was already shared by the panelists?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very good to be with, in a way, the instigators of the reason why the Scientific Advisory Board is here. I think, I can comment that I think there's only 3 of us here, but it's 15 of us, and I think the experience so far is, we've been working in a very collaborative manner to really try to understand our role and reflect on our role, which I think, particularly at this time, is particularly critical to stay the course, because as Martin just said, the timing of when the Scientific Advisory Board, was coincided with a kind of defining moment, I think, for policies in the EU. So I think, indeed, for us, some of us come from the IPCC, so reflecting on our role is a little bit different because it's really, as you say, it's much more about informing policy. I think also I take on board that the Commission values that it's because good policy has to be based on a solid basis and solid science, and also that I think we've also had discussions with the meeting the 1.5 target and sticking to the Paris Agreement and the target. I think that even internally we understand the difficulties, but we still think that the science is very clear. I think also that we've taken on board that there's some kind of tasks, as Otmar presented, that are mandated by the climate law. So we have to, in a way, step up and really kind of fulfill that role, because that's, in a way, why we were created. But I think also it's been quite exciting to see that different bodies of the European, from the European bodies have been asking, for us to have possibly new tasks. I think we reflected ourselves that there we would also kind of be independent. Also, partly because of resources, we are very, very privileged to have an extremely strong secretariat that have been our guiding star in a way since we were born. I want to give them a lot of credit. It was not easy, and I think that they've really guided us very well. And I think also that one of the biggest values I see from having spent time together now is that we bring a lot of disciplines, which I think is really what is needed. It's such a complex problem, from agriculture. And I also want to, I was particularly keen to come this time because it was really about adaptation as well. So I think adaptation is really very much on the agenda. We're also aware that, in a way, we need to stretch and put a hand out to other parts of Europe that are not so represented in the advisory board. And even the gender issue, we're also aware. So we're also kind of... all these things we've taken on board and reflected. And just as a final comment, I think, thinking also, from the Secretary of State from Finland, it was very, very... I think I have very good memories of the first experience of spending time with the national councils and the strength that we can gather from working together and also understanding our roles and learning from them. We had very, very valuable experiences. We saw similar kind of reflections and issues that we could address. And I think that's going to, for us, going to be one of the key issues that we have. I'm Spanish myself. We're also in the process of 3 new councils that are about to be born. So again, we want to kind of support them as well, so that then also we're now decided that we're going to be joining the ICCN. So then we take the global issue as well. So I think we basically, I think, understand the importance of, kind of making science speak loudly at this point.
Thank you so much. Just for those not aware, the ICCN is a network of the national and now also European regional climate councils. So a coordinating system where we share experience on how we're fulfilling this independent scientific advisory role to policy. It's an interesting complement, as you said, to the role that the IPCC has fulfilled for a long time in the Climate Change Convention. And you see many countries now setting up often similar, but also slightly different examples. And I think there's a lot to learn. And you were already referring earlier that even in establishing the European Scientific Advisory Board, you'd built on that science. Any reflections from the other panelists on what the members have just said? Let's go in order. Michael, you go first.
I just want to also again point out that it's really important to have the policy advice, and I just want to cite two different climate advisory boards from national areas. What we had in our mind was a little bit looking at the UK. And in the UK, the Scientific Advisory Board, it has a very strong role. It actually can even suggest policies and suggest that openly, and the government has to respond to these suggestions and even explain if they're not following this. And I think that's really good, because that's the debate we need to have very much in the open. And just a recent example in Germany, I'm from the government party, the Green Party in Germany, but our climate advisory board told us very clearly that we are, with current policies, not on track in meeting our own targets, and especially looking at the transport sector, we are not on track. And we have to, I think we have to really accept this as politicians, accept also this critique, because it's stating the facts. It's not like a critique in terms of like a political critique that you have to gain voters, but it's just, if you look at the policies that are in place, with what we have in place on the transport sector, we will not reach there, which we also put into law and told our voters where we want to get. And I think that's super important, and also kind of changes the debate from a debate where you have, different political parties. They always need to criticize each other just from the rationality of the political sphere. But this should not determine climate policies. But what we need to determine climate policies is the reality of the planet and of our policies, and that's what you can tell us basically, and what we want to know from you.
Thank you, and it speaks to the importance of the independence of the committee. At the same time, also something that we're aware needs to be protected and cherished, right? If we start straying from the science and giving our own opinions for the sake of our opinions, we'll very quickly lose that credibility. So it's a balance that we see as, a precious gift given to us to take this independent role, but also to be taken very seriously. So, but thank you for that illustration also of how that's playing out right now, for instance, in Germany. Clara, any other comments from your end?
Yes, I would like to highlight another dimension of the role of this eminent ladies and gentlemen, which is raising awareness of the science behind the policy, and raising awareness about what science tells us about the impacts of climate change. Because it's very important, it's very difficult to explain to a citizen that there is an increase of 1.5 degrees. It's not that much, 1.5 degrees. So explaining that, passing that message is very important. So if I say it myself, I'll say she has an interest. But if scientists explain to people what happens when temperature goes beyond certain things and why there are irreversible effects, because that's, I think, something also that's important for all of us to understand as citizens, that there are irreversible effects. This is why when some parties, for very good reasons, ask for more time, we can't give that time, because whatever time is given, this time is lost. And that I would very much appreciate this, your support in having those. Many of you are professors, and you have not only the research capabilities, but also the pedagogic capabilities in helping us passing these messages.
Thank you so much. And we do see that as a very important part of our mission as well. Of course, one that needs to grow as our advice comes out. But I think a very important part, a cornerstone, I would say, of climate policy. But also, even more important, as more difficult choices will need to be made in society that deal with an ambitious transition, but sometimes also questions of winners and losers, for instance. So it's partly the climate impacts in general for the planet and the ecology, but also in the context of the just transition, for instance. Mapping this out, providing clear scientific advice will be incredibly important. So we hope to serve you well in that sense.
I just actually wanted to come back on something that Michael Bloss just also mentioned about the panel maybe having even a more formal role, or being able to propose something or challenge or ask for a review of government policy. And we considered this when we were reviewing our Climate Act as we were putting the climate neutrality into the law. And we were considering that. There was quite a bit of demand for giving the panel even more formal role in establishing a climate budget, or being able to propose or reject government policies. But in the end, we didn't change that because it could have risked the independence of the panelists, and now it's been very strong in our case that it's the members of the panel selected on the basis of their scientific merit, and it hasn't been politicized, and we feared that if they would become a kind of a policymaker, there could be a risk that that nomination would become politicized and it would become more difficult. So we decided not to, but I would just encourage the European board also to develop this strong independence and to be brave and bold to pass the uncomfortable messages, but based on science, and so I think the politicians can take it. And also, I wouldn't want to remove the responsibility from the politicians, that they have to make the hard choices. And sometimes politicians will not be able to make the most cost-efficient choice, for example. Sometimes it's not the politically most acceptable. And then we will just have to be able to defend why we are doing some policies that are more costly than what would be the most cost-efficient or rational way to go. But I think we need the science base and fact base, but at the same time, we shouldn't remove the responsibility from the democratic institutions.
Great. Thank you so much. I see Jean-François already eager to respond to that. If I may ask you, while you continue the discussion among the panel, to start taking into account some of the questions that we've been getting from, I don't know, someone here or someone online. With the first one, for instance, being how work on policy consistency might drive better climate coordination also at the international level. I don't know if you can weave that into anything you might answer to the panelists.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for your comment. It's exactly what we feel, that we need to provide that independent advice. But as you said, Martin, cherishing our scientific skills and not entering into the policy arena for sure. However, there is this question of how could you get something a bit more formal. And in my own experience in the French committee, the government answers our annual report after 6 months. And I don't think we have this yet in the climate law. So it would be something to be considered. Should some European institutions provide some answers, some comments on the reports that we are providing? This could be a way of not compromising with the policy arena, but getting a virtuous cycle, with reports and responses. So that was my comments, very well aligned with the panelists. And yes, let me try to take the first question then. Certainly, this is really the vision, I think, of this international network of climate committees. How could we, through those national climate committees, get improved policy consistency to drive the climate action in countries and then at international level? I think this is a huge issue here at COP27. We have heard, for instance, in Glasgow, of many coalitions that are ambitious, and there were some also in past conferences. But do we know what has happened? Did this really happen? I'm not so sure. And I think if we want to get accountability, we need to, that's also part of the big debate here with the implementation track, how can we show what's happening in countries and with international coalition? I guess those committees could help in these matters. Thank you.
Any other reflections on that first question? Otherwise, we'll continue straight to the next one. So the EU's energy system, I'm not sure if I will already sign off to that statement as the European Scientific Advisory Board, but the EU's energy system is currently inadequate. When will the advisory board comment on what should be done?
That's a question to you.
Exactly, it's a question to us, so I don't know if you would immediately want to address it.
No, well, certainly I will not, say anything about the statement, but about the question. We are working on the energy crisis, and that's one subgroup, and we are active in trying to develop something that is evidence-based and that may provide advice.
Yeah. Yeah, I subscribe what Jean-François just said. I think in a way that was our first test. You know, the instinct was to kind of, it's such a defining moment almost because it's so important. But I think that's where we really had to analyze, and we really have to, again, really document, you know, our advice. So just for whoever asked the question, we are definitely considering it, and I think as a preview, I think we're really keeping our focus on the long term, you know, so that the policies really keep us on track, you know, based on the evidence that we see that we really have to stay the course.
Thank you. Yeah, I might add from my side, I don't think one scientific advisory board with 15 members, as brilliant as we think we may be, and about 15-person secretariat, and I can certainly vouch for them being very brilliant, would be able to say, for instance, what needs to be done to fix everything on energy in Europe, right? But one thing that we can do is, from a climate perspective, say what are the choices policymakers are confronting them, what hard things need to be considered, and also where is there a risk, again, coming back to that important point you just made about the short term and the long term. Where are there risks that fixing some things in the short term will lock you into less space in the longer term future? And that's the sort of advice that we are already putting together in the context of the current energy crisis and should be coming out relatively soon to indeed be relevant also to policy decisions being taken right now. Let's take the next one. Will the Scientific Advisory Board speak to the overall ambition which is required for the EU for 1.5 degrees? So, for example, is minus 55% sufficient for 1.5 degrees?
Thank you. Well, we rather have a lot of work on the starting point, which is the Fit for 55, and how this Fit for 55 will be implemented in the end. That's still, I know there is an agreement, and Michel can certainly, or Clara can explain this much better than me. But for us, it's very important to see how all this is being developed, because it will, in fact, affect also the next decades. So we are creating pathways, and those initial pathways are very important for the next decades. So it is, in some sense, a starting point. I think it would be even more important, and that's what we are doing, to consider what to do for 2040 and then for 2050, then question, is this Fit for 55 exactly what should have been done? I mean, that's more of a theoretical question, isn't it?
Please.
I mean, of course, I will not answer this question because it's not addressed to me. But I just want to explain a little bit also how the development was during the negotiations of the climate law. So, I mean, basically, at this time, it's quite a different story, but I mean, we were not able to write into the climate law 1.5 degrees, but we just set Paris targets. And of course, the debate was always, you know, what is climate neutrality in 2050 worth? Because it can mean so many different things. I mean, you can, you know, stop or kind of stop polluting in 2040, or you can start reducing now. And it's completely different to what it means for the climate. So the important thing is not so much, you know, when are we climate neutral. The important thing is how much CO2 are we emitting until this point. And we have been debating about this also, whether the EU should have, or we want to put a greenhouse gas budget for the EU, but then, of course, there's difficult choices to make. I mean, how do we constitute this budget? What are the fairness dimension of it? So do we count from 1992, or do we count all historical, or what? So one of these, this basically resulted in one of these very specific tasks that you have in a minute, which is the establishment of the greenhouse gas budget for the EU from the year 2030 onwards. And I'm looking very much forward what you have to tell to us. And I mean, it's really good that you also make these choices that are connected to this question transparent. But yeah, maybe that could be at least one step forward to having an honest debate about 1.5 degrees and what is EU's contribution to it.
I hope that answers whoever asked that question. And as you can see, if even our political, the ones we are providing political advice to already need so many words to explain what's really important and needed, then you can imagine one of our tasks as scientists is also providing this advice in a succinct way that will also be carried forward to the wider public to also be taken along in some of these choices that are being made at the moment. And that's partly your job as politicians, explaining your choices, but we also see it as our part as scientists laying out those choices really clearly. So I hope we can help with that as well in our work. A next question is a broader one, and I'd be interested to hear also how you reflect on this, maybe even with your colleagues in other directorates, Clara. Can this scientific advisory board serve as a blueprint for boards advisory on other issues, such as pandemics? Maybe it's too early to tell, given that we've just started, but I guess there is experience from national councils. Maybe we should hear the Finnish experience on that as well.
Yeah, I don't know whether I mean the concept is a with due respect very simple concept. I mean you need to inform your policy, and you take persons that can advise you now. This you know that in science policy we have also a scientific advisory mechanism, and the foundation says similar number of persons who are knowledgeable in both in science and in the policy, and trying to give an advice. And also, we have used that experience when designing this advisory board, having the independence to give advice, or not only on request, but they have their own, so that they are free to teach to precisely as Reddy was saying. To call you to, I wouldn't say to order, but to say, hi, there is an important issue there that you have not addressed to. So the concept, as I say, is a simple context, and we use that in agriculture. We have also scientific committees. Remember when we have the story, the sad story, or the so-called mad cow, there were a number of scientific committees that were being developed. We have that in several realms. So the principle is a principle which gives solidity and credibility to a policy. And it's not with me that we have to push saying that science is one of the most important components of any policy.
Thank you. Any Finnish experience on this?
I wanted to share an experience. We have established a nature panel to look at the biodiversity challenge and policy. And that is a new one. I think we set it up in 2019, and now we are just revising our nature conservation law, where we would then again establish this panel also in law. It's still in our parliament as we speak. Again, the panel would be looking at the policies needed to stop or halt the loss of biodiversity, and how to develop a nature positive policy. And again, they have been active and very instrumental in helping us devise the policy for voluntary compensation mechanism that would also be established in the new nature conservation law.
Right. So that has a similar makeup also with a formal legal basis and an independence.
Indeed.
To have that.
And formally scientist based on best science. We also have a sustainable development panel, but I must say that I don't remember 100% certain if that was equally fully scientific, or if there's other expertise also on the panel. And it maybe hasn't been as much used in policy design context, but as now climate policy, for example.
Great, thank you. Let me go to the next question, which I think is an interesting one also, to tell a bit more about the composition of the advisory board. And Otmar took you through it really quickly, but the question here is, how much do you consider the balance between basic science and applied science regarding climate change for policy and decision making? Do you want to say a bit more about our colleagues and how we're made up and how we bring these pieces together?
We'll start and hand it to you, Elena. Yes, certainly we are really privileged to have a very diverse panel in terms of the science mix, and this is greatly helpful for our work, because we could not tackle such broad issues without having that broad base in science. Let me advocate for two things here. One is that basic science is still hugely important. We should not consider this area of climate change as something without uncertainties, and we should not say that there are not going to be possible surprises. Actually, when you look into the literature, you see that climate scientists are questioning some of the extreme events in terms of, let's say, atmospheric circulation, with some relatively new findings. And they are also questioning if our models are fully adequate to reflect what's happening in Europe. In fact, and that's quite unfortunate, the level of climate extremes we experience in Europe is something that is above what was in the climate models. So we are encountering even more problems than we thought.
So what
here
we
again,
thought was the most simple climate extreme, a heat wave, right? We
Exactly,
thought that's the
exactly.
one, okay,
Yeah.
we have a general temperature increase, you get a shift of the whole distribution, you just get more extremes.
Yeah.
I mean, rainfall that goes through clouds, and that's much more
Exactly,
complicated. Heat waves are
exactly.
simple.
Yeah.
Well, not in Europe. Indeed, we're being surprised by how fast the extremes are rising.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and we experienced this last summer. It was huge, really. So you know, there are those uncertainties, surprises, and basic science is hugely important there. The other thing is that we need to create a new science, in fact. We need to create systems approach at unprecedented level. I can tell you I'm working on the agriculture, on the food systems. Tackling, in terms of science, the complexity of the full food system is huge, really huge. And it has not been done. I mean, we need to progress a lot. So you may call this applied science, but I would call it system science.
I think, I think I can vouch for the fact that it's extremely important that we are diverse as a scientific advisory board in our disciplines. And I think also that we're going to definitely kind of also convene other scientists, you know. I think that's going to be one of our most important jobs, particularly, for example, for Central and Eastern Europe as well, because we're aware, again, of our composition. So I think, but I also completely agree with Jean-François. I mean, I think, you know, basic science is critical. You know, we don't know everything. There's still a lot of things we need to know, that which also we know as a scientific advisory board is no excuse for no action. I mean, I think we are aware, the science is already clear that you know, there is an urgency. I think, for example, I guess because I'm more on that side, not just also basic science and applied science, but for example, one of the things that I think is going to be very interesting in the future is behavioral science. You know, like really bringing the social sciences to the fore, particularly now that we're entering, you know, this not just transition, but transforming systems. So I think we, you know, we will, as much as possible, bring in all the, and I completely agree, it's systems we're talking about, and systems transformation. So that means we will need to really, you know, get help from as many scientists as possible when we prepare the reports.
Great. And indeed, we're just, I think, a very diverse group with networks in many areas of science that will need to bring all that other expertise on board rather than doing it all ourselves. And of course, with an excellent secretariat, also bringing additional skills to the table. We're almost at the end. There's one final question. I mean, you already hinted a couple of times that in terms of geographic representation, we're not perfectly balanced yet, but also the makeup of where we have national advisory councils in Europe is not perfectly balanced. There are a number of EU member states that don't have national advisory councils yet. There are 20 to 30 national climate advisory councils across the world. What role can the EU play advancing this concept that apparently has benefits for individual member states and for the EU, to other member states, but also to other countries around the world?
The climate law already mentions, and I have the article with me, saying the context of Israel. Now I lost. Yeah, each member state is invited to establish a national climate advisory body responsible for providing scientific expertise. So, of course, the Union has no competence in obliging anyone. Its governance and in the way it sets us its expertise. But as experience shows, this is quite an effective way of governance of the policy making. So it's with all our encouragement. I think a similar process is happening with Chief Scientific Officer. There are some countries that have, some others don't have, but the law gives a clear, not legal signal, but a clear political signal saying, go for it, it's healthy, it's producing its good effects. But I'm sure Letty has much better direct experience on that one.
Well, I would just want to say that what we do is we see that some of the EU member states that are not don't yet have a science panel that are working on it. So we're happily sharing our experience and giving, the wonderful support that we have gotten. I think some of the countries and member states might be worried that a science panel would be an activist panel in a sense that it would somehow embarrass governments. But this is, in our experience, is not the case. I mean, the facts might be harsh and challenges might be big, but it's our scientists are respectful people and they will respect the democratic process as well. So there's only things to gain. And again, saying this to colleagues from other member states, that already giving a reference point for the public debate, for media, for a go-to point for independent, balanced, scientific, fact-based advice is a great thing for the national debate. So we just encourage colleagues to take the leap and start establishing their own panels as well.
Thank you very much. We're out of time. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it here, but I think that was a beautiful sum up also of the value as we share across this panel, and I think with many of the questions coming in from the audience alike, about having these sorts of interfaces between science and policy. We feel very privileged with the mandate that we've been given. We'll give it our very, very best. We'll take all the questions that we have not been able to answer along with us in our work program. So you might hear from some of us in a distant future. For those of you who are here, I just want to point out Francois, Miles and Rasmus from the Secretariat, as well as the three of us that you have already been introduced to. Happy to continue the discussion also at the end of the event. Thank you all, and thank you for those online, and thank you to the panelists. Let's have a round of applause.